reliable, but what were your
You
thoughts
do it
about the guy
however
who's
however
like,
you want to do it.
I think he was getting a little too cozy with the source. He
So
was
you're
like,
talking.
you can tell me anything you want. I think he was trying to like pseudo romance or friend her. It was some weird sexual tension there.
So you're talking about Gabriel. He was the
Yeah.
young dude who was talking to the farmer, the grower of the biggest cabbage. They got an award for the biggest cabbage. I mean, so there's two there's there's two places where something's either that you're either in the clear or that you're completely wrong. If you think of it as like he's talking to a source, he can be flirty, he can be friendly or whatever, and I mean, and that's for better or for worse. That's how some journalists use, what they do in order to cultivate a source and use that source to get information. It doesn't usually help for a source to be like antagonistic from the beginning. So he's I didn't really see anything wrong with it. That is at least is how they portrayed it to that level in that episode. He was fine because there's no give and take. He can be flirty. It's at the point where there's like give and take, where there's a clear relationship, that there's a line that gets crossed, right? Because you could see it as a quid pro quo. You could see it as like information for sex, information for romance, or whatever, or using sex to get information, however that is. So that's the other end of the spectrum, which is clearly wrong. There's a huge amount of gray area in the middle. And I think that one of the reasons there's so much gray area, because this isn't, there's not really much case law involved here, right? Like this all comes down to journalistic ethics, and different journalists, have different perspectives on this. Different outlets have different perspectives. So I don't think there was anything wrong there. I do think that it was kind of getting close. That you're right. There was certainly a potential before he found out that her father was potentially a white supremacist terrorist or whatever he was, for it to cross that line at some point. If it was after he wrote the story, then it wouldn't have been a big deal. The next time the fair comes around, if she's the big cabbage winner again, and he's in a relationship with her, then yeah, there would be a significant problem there. I don't think that's how some people also do react with each other. It did seem clear that they liked each other, and that might have started to cloud his judgment. And I think that if she was a source with, like, I don't know, national secrets, national defense secrets that potentially could be the difference between life and death, then you kind of have to have a bigger conversation.
What would the big conversation be?
Whether or not he's the right person to be getting that information from her. Otherwise, but see, this is again because we've seen this in outlets where I'll try to think of an example, but where Petraeus, like General Petraeus, remember the journalist who was writing a book and started sleeping with him, and then actually was able to, he relinquished a number of classified, a bunch of classified information that she was able to use. And of course he got in trouble. She wasn't necessarily in trouble per se, but it really tainted her as a journalist. And the conversation there is like whether or not you need to be close enough. Because remember, actually in Washington D.C., one thing to remember is like most journalist sources, and this is both good and bad, most journalist sources are the journalist's friends. They're people that they went to college with, or they worked together with, and they had internships with, or they are roommates with, and that's where a lot of journalists are getting this information. They cultivate sources over years and years, and then when they're older, they have this network. So that's how a lot of it works. But at some point, yeah, and I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I think there's a lot of problems there, because I think that journalists start to see things in terms of axis, primarily in terms of axis, and they're willing to do things like, there's a lot of information that, one gripe that I have, if you look at Nina Totenberg's relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which only came out to how deep it was only recently after RBG's death, when Nina Totenberg basically says, yeah, we're really good friends. We're hanging out all the time. And, we had dinners together and so forth. And it was like, what did Nina Totenberg find out during that time that would have been in the public interest that she never exposed? And RBG was a close friend of Antonin Scalia. And Antonin Scalia probably told RBG all kinds of things. And RBG probably said, "Oh, don't report this, but like, let me tell you, Nina, let me tell you this thing that Scalia said." And Nina's probably sitting there thinking, "Oh my God, this is so publishable. But if I go publish it, then I'm betraying my good friend RBG."
Things are so dangerous that you probably should call law enforcement. How does that affect your story? Because you have a message to try to get clicks, like you said, try to get readers and stuff. So you will still want to report on something.
There is some obligation. I mean, if you think about this in terms of a therapist or a lawyer, who have who are required by law. In these cases, it's actually a legal requirement. They're required by law to protect their to protect their client, right? Now, there's caveats to that. There's exceptions, and the exception is if that client is in immediate danger, not just in danger, but in immediate danger to themselves or others. So, I don't, I think in his situation, I can't say, there was some ethical obligation not report to the police, but to actually report to the police if there was sufficient, if they had sufficient reason to believe that that there was a danger there. Now, at that point, then the question becomes, okay, now are you part of the story, or can you still objectively report on the story? And and then that's when they have to have the conversation again, case by case basis. I think that at that point somebody else has to pick up the story. And now the journalist who reported to the police is actually part of this. The stories is now a source as opposed to. But yeah, I didn't see like too much wrong with, again, assuming the premise. I mean, I felt like a little bit like there might have been a potential stretch. And they even admitted, like in the newsroom later, that they didn't know what was going on. But it's up to the people.
I think there's I think another mundane detail of that episode is that the reporter has an assignment for a Cabbage Patch competition and thought it was boring and one is unable to fill word space. Then he goes to the person's home to try to dig up more dirt. I think no editor in their right mind would ever say, take this boring story further. You would probably just fill up some, you'd probably just curtail the word space. If it's 800, curtail it to 300, and then assign some other fluff story. I don't know.
Is that an ethical question though? But I liked your use of the pun, to dig up more dirt since it was a farm.
Oh yeah.
Pun intended, right? But I mean, is that an ethical question?
It's not an ethical question. It just did the writers do their homework? Is it a realistic thing about the show?
Well, I didn't mind it because I like the I thought that Gabriel, was that his name, that he it was more about this guy, his first story, his first time out, and he really wants to do a good job, right? Like he's going to go over and beyond. He's going to make some story that would probably usually be, lower, page 3, lower half of the page, into something that he thinks will be more impressive because he wants the next big story he wants to do. So he's going to overdo it. When Hilary Swank gave him the advice to go to the farm, of course she's coming at it from a completely different perspective, right? Like she's no longer she's like literally go up and dig dirt because that's where she is at in her career. Like she is, she's gonna go get everything. She's gonna go to go get all the facts. She's gonna go to the base, like the air base, like she does later. She's going to do it. But you're right. Like it I don't think any editor would do that, but it doesn't surprise me that like this young reporter who wants, to take the most advantage of his shot would, really try to like, write something that's bigger and more impressive.
Okay, so one thing is that, but wouldn't Hilary Swank's character be tone deaf to suggest you go that above and beyond? In addition, doesn't it carry risks of antagonizing the source? Most of my career was in local newspapers, and a lot of those things were, don't bother anyone more than you have to. Like, if one of those sources complains about you, then, like, that greatly impacts your career negatively, so...
Well, you might have spent more time in local journalism, and I respect that a lot because I think that local journalism is highly undervalued. But I mean, you're right in the sense that like it was that much more realistic because he did antagonize them, right? When he showed up at the door, she was not very happy about that. She was off put. She was surprised, and he said, "Oh, I just want to like make this a more interesting story." Now, if you're a source and you're up until this point you believe this is going to be a positive story because you won the biggest Cabbage Award, then you're probably going to be like, yeah, let's, I want to be a star. Sure. I like the fact that you're talking to, somebody's going to take interest in this. You're talking to me about it. But you're right. Like they did catch that. They did say, now, obviously she had probably more to hide, in regards to her father, she literally asked, right? Like, what are you doing here? I mean, so you're right. Again, what do they say about good journalism? Is it it comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfort? Now, in this particular case, like so in other words, antagonism is part of the job. But you're right. Why antagonize somebody just because they won the award for largest cabbage?
I think that local journalism is different than the journalism that. Local journalism is largely fluff. I think there's almost nothing in local journalism that is worth antagonizing the community members over.
But see, I think that at least in modern times that might be a failure of local journalism. Look, I don't think you ever really you antagonize people just because they live in the community. But there are people in power, and that's where local journalism of late is failing, and not because they aren't good reporters and so forth. It's just because they don't have the same kind of resources in order to do, But like Tip O'Neill said, right? Like all politics is local. A lot of the things that we see that eventually happen in national politics start at the local level, whether policy or whatever. So I think there's a lack of that kind of investigative quality investigative journalism at the local level, and that's going to include eventually include community members. Because what if you have a town that's, I don't know, say 60% of the town voted to ban single mothers or something so outlandish? It's like those people who voted to for that ban, aren't they worth asking, why did you vote for that ban?
Maybe have some business interest in being featured. People, maybe you're interviewing their dad and their dad wants their kid to look good, things like that. Yeah.
Have you been asked to do an interview on a podcast or a radio show for any of your stories?
What do you mean?
Well, sometimes broadcasts sees your print stories and asks you, ask print reporters to like talk about it, like, oh well, we wanted to report on that, so we'll talk to the journalist.
Can't remember. I think there was a newspaper in Lynchburg that was interested. Once there was a radio station in Spain that copied one of my stories without telling me, so that was amusing.
I kind of assumed you had been because you're pretty prolific, so I just kind of assumed that. I think there's enough like podcasts out there with movie themes nowadays, and a lot of them very successful because
Oh, I've been on other people's podcasts.
Well, that's what I'm asking. That's what I'm asking about. Like, yeah. That's what I'm asking. If you've been on radio shows or podcasts, like
I've been on podcasts, but not about a story I wrote, because I consider film criticism to be a bit of a different beast.
So I get your distinction, and I agree. And actually, I think this is one of the, again, we could talk about the problems with journalism, but the point being, like, you went on these podcasts because you enjoy talking about these things. It gets your work out there more and so forth. So like even us, like, we have a self-interest in being being interviewed, right? So
yeah. It feels like there are certain like limitations, or there are certain ways the show is structured for TV that they're trying to make a TV show. I think in the mold of a procedural. Procedurals are kind of shows about cops or lawyers or doctors, and it's like, so they're trying to make her an action hero, I think, as much as you can for a journalist. Which is why I think that, like, they're trying to make journalism as sexy as possible and as action-oriented as possible. I don't know if they're pushing the boundaries of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Due to the genre, right? Like, there was an older movie called Foreign Correspondent a long time ago, and there's a great line because he's this freelance journalist who goes to war zones and stuff, and somebody says, "Can you write a story on whatever?" And he says, "If you give me a big enough expense account, I can write whatever, I can report on anything." And so to me, it's actually it's more unique or more interesting when a story comes along that actually, where journalists are portrayed more, I think, based on actual motivations. I think of the Paper with Michael Keaton, one of my favorite journalism movies ever. I find those a lot more interesting. So yeah, I do think you're absolutely right. Her life is thrilling, and then she gets sent to Alaska. But I think most of us would be kind of think that was thrilling too. But like, yeah, I mean, she's got death threats, right? Are death threats sexy? I mean, the idea of like having you're doing something that evokes that kind of intensity from someone else is certainly, makes it more of an action thriller type, or procedural, like you were saying.
Unfortunately, I think death threats are a legitimate thing that happens in journalism at certain levels.
At certain levels, I mean, who was it that there was a journalist in New York where a congressman threatened to throw him over a balcony of a hotel, and and that made really big news. And one of the reasons was because, like, that just doesn't happen in this country, like death threat, and well, probably wasn't even a serious like death threat, but it doesn't happen in this country so much. But certainly journalists have targets on their back, especially when they're in foreign places.
I think during the Trump administration, a lot of the MAGA crowd was probably attacking anyone who was critical of Trump, I'm sure.
Well, and you're right, and actually you're right, that did change. I was in the Middle East, and I was like shot at and tear gassed, right? So like I kind of being in DC or any part of the US, I was in Haiti, like, towards the end of well, not this round, but the last round of gang rule and so forth, where I was just in enough places where, like, people had machine guns 3 inches from me, and may or may not have been hostile to my intentions.
So when we're talking about, there was a woman with advocacy for the diner, and she came into the article being like, I want to save the diner. I have to confess, I think going back to like college newspaper days, like someone's like, oh, my friend's in a band, I'm gonna feature them in the arts center section of the newspaper, or I want to, I was a runner, and like I remember that in track and field, like, we didn't had people showing up to our meets. We had, all the cheerleaders and the marching bands would go to football. So I wanted to cover the cross country and track team in college. And so, like, you have your personal interest in why you want to cover something. And a lot of time, again, if it's more to the human interest vein, you want to highlight it. But I wasn't sure if she crossed over into advocacy.
Yeah. Now, the bigger issue there for me, you know, it's a fine line between like journalism and advocacy, right? And so advocacy journalism is a real thing. And I think that's actually what we have a lot of, in especially now, but to some degree always, right? Like if there are, let's say, if there's a famine in Ethiopia or something, not to pick on Ethiopia, which has had its share of famine. Your principal, like most journalists are going to want to cover the famine as a way to hopefully expose an issue and get help for the people who are starving, right? Now that's journalism. Is it advocacy journalism? I mean, they're trying to do good. They're trying to do help. They're trying to help a bunch of people who've really gotten the short end of the stick, right? And then so you see that a lot. And then it comes to like, I don't know, single mothers in this country. There's so many issues, and that when we write about them, we write it from a particular perspective, which is, how can we do good? I mean, isn't that what most journalists, most altruistic journalists actually want to do? They want to do good. It's not just being a monger of truth. It's like changing the world for better, or changing some situation for better. So it gets a little bit muddled, I think, in the scenario you're talking about, because the journalist there was a good friend of the diner and also had a very personal interest in the diner, right? Like the journalist who goes and covers the famine in Africa, the only personal interest that they have is that they don't like to see suffering, and might be why they got into journalism. They want to combat suffering. They want to combat injustice, but like if you're writing about your friend's diner town, now the only latitude that I'm going to give them with this one, because her being the good friend of the owner, she shouldn't really have been writing the story. She just shouldn't. She was too close to the story. The only latitude that I would give is like, it's a small newspaper in a small town. Who else do you get to write about it? You know what I mean? Like remember they were all in the newsroom. I was like, oh, I love that place, right? Oh yeah, I go there every morning. It's like, it's this like institution to them that they really like. So like, I don't know that objectivity was, possible at all. And that's, and I mean, and maybe you tell me, right? Like in local journalism, especially in a very small community,